Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 634, and today is July 12th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today I'm joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Before we get into the content today, got to remind people that at the Libertarian Institute, where we both work and produce a lot of content for, we are holding our summer fundraiser. About twice a year, we ask you all to make some donations so we could continue to produce content with, no corporate backer, so everything's independent. And at the same time, our content is not behind a paywall. Everything is free and open to everyone because our goal is to spread the truth. And so help us out in that mission. Go to libertarianinstitute.org and make a donation, as well as daily articles, podcasts. We publish books, including books this past year by Tom Woods, James Bovard, Laura Calhoun, our good buddy Keith Knight, among several others. So head on over to the Institute. If you make a donation, you could get one of our books as a kickback. You could also just purchase some books to help us out that way. Whatever you could do, share our content, make a contribution. We always appreciate it. And Connor, now let's get into today's content. All right, the first article I have up here today is from Dave DeCamp, our colleague over at antiwar.com. He writes, Russian officials vow response to U.S. missile deployment in Germany. And so this was something we discussed on yesterday's episode of the show, that the U.S. was going to deploy land-based Tomahawk missiles to Germany. This is highly provocative because these missiles were banned by the INF Treaty, or the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is something that Donald Trump withdrew from in 2019. And so we have the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, responding to the announcement saying, without nerves, without emotions, we will develop a military response, first of all, to this new game. He called the U.S. decision disruptive to regional safety and strategic stability. Now, Connor, the INF Treaty was something that was truly groundbreaking when it was signed because it eliminated an entire class of missiles. All missiles land-based from 310 miles to 3,400 miles in range were completely eliminated. And so this meant that Europe was largely taken off the board of a possible nuclear exchange between the US and Russia. This is absolutely huge development, something that is really important, especially because when we're talking about these land-based cruise missiles, they're able to be deployed to countries that are 1,800 miles from Russia, which means Moscow has a very short time to determine if these cruise missiles are nuclear capable or not, and how to issue their own response to a potential attack from one of these sites. And so this has been a lingering issue for over a decade because the U.S. deployed its Aegis Ashore system to Poland and Romania, and these use the Mk-41 launchers that can hold Tomahawk missiles. Now, the U.S. has always insisted that they won't deploy the land-based Tomahawk missiles, and that we don't actually have in our arsenal right now. We disbanded them, I believe, in the 90s, a Tomahawk missile that could carry a nuclear weapon. Still, Russia viewed this as a threat, but remained within the INF Treaty. The Americans withdrew from the treaty, and while they used the pretense of what Russia was doing, in reality, what was going on is the Americans wanted to deploy these weapons to the Asia Pacific in order to use them against China. And we've already seen this because they deployed the Typhoon launcher system to the Philippines for war games, which was viewed as highly provocative by China. So this is a major escalation and a major concern, and something that I think we're going to be talking about for months to come here. Next up, I have this article from Haaretz. I linked to it on my Twitter account. It's titled, How Netanyahu Systematically Foiled Talks to Release Hostages from Hamas Captivity. And they write, the past 6 months during which the Israeli negotiations for a framework for the release of Israeli hostages being held captive by Hamas in the Gaza Strip were riddled with hopeful moments that shattered one after the other. While Hamas impeded talks, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu repeatedly torpedoed their progress, particularly when it came to decisive moments. Netanyahu believes that an agreement on a hostage deal will most likely lead to a government collapse, which he seeks to avoid at all costs. Defense officials who spoke with Haaretz said that in an attempt to derail negotiations, Netanyahu relied on classified intelligence and manipulation of sensitive information. This is how Netanyahu systematically foiled negotiations to free the hostages. And I recommend, if people want to go look at the article, they have an entire timeline laid out there. But really, this is just confirming what we've been reporting on the show during every marker on this timeline over the past 6 months, which is every time there's progress in negotiations, every time Hamas starts to make concessions, the Americans and the Qataris and the Egyptians come out and they say, hey, this is the deal that we have. The Israelis will come out and say, well, we will never sign anything that says we can't restart military operations once our hostages are freed, which is an obvious non-starter for Hamas. They're not going to release the hostages unless it comes with a permanent ceasefire. And so that's the main rhetoric that Netanyahu has used to foil the talks over this extended period of time and dread the war out. I really do believe Netanyahu wants to keep this war going. And while the Haaretz report here says that what is going on is Netanyahu's essentially afraid of his right wing, that this is the leverage that Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, their Jewish Power Party, has over, and the Religious Zionism Party has over the Israeli government. In reality, Connor, Yair Lapid, the opposition to Netanyahu, whose party I think holds 24 seats in the Knesset, it is a significant force. His party has come out and said that they will be willing to support and back the Netanyahu government to allow it to keep its majority in the event that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich withdraw from it if Netanyahu makes a hostage deal. So the real issue here, I don't think, Connor, is Netanyahu holding on to power, at least as far as he's afraid of his far right wing. Now, he may assess, I think, a few things of why he wants to continue this war. One, the longer he's a wartime president, the longer he remains in office. There's no question to his rule as long as this war is going on. Once it ends, very likely going to be elections, and the outcome could be not so good for Benjamin Netanyahu, including that could ultimately lead him going to jail. I also think Netanyahu assesses that this war going on at least through the November election, and assuming a Trump victory right on through January, he essentially has a free hand to operate, because the worse he acts, whatever Washington does, whatever the White House does, if it does anything to punish Netanyahu, even a verbal slapdown, if Israel, say, bombs a UN school, and then the U.S. says, oh, we really wish you wouldn't do that, and Matthew Miller wags his finger and, kind of grinning at the same time in front of the State Department press corps, and that's kind of the limit to the punishment Israel receives. The problem, or I guess not the problem, the benefit for Israel is that Trump or even RFK Jr. are going to react by attacking Biden for not being more supportive of what they say is America's most important ally in the Middle East. So essentially, Netanyahu's almost in a position now where the worse he acts, the more belligerent the Israeli military is in Gaza. Any reaction that gets provoked from the White House, the counter reaction is more helpful to what Netanyahu ultimately wants. And I think Netanyahu is somebody who understands American politics very well, and maybe is exploiting this dynamic as we move through the election season here. But we will see how that develops. And Connor, I also think another reason that Netanyahu doesn't want a deal is ultimately he really does want to see the ethnic cleansing in Gaza. This is not something being enforced upon him by the Israeli right wing. This is something that I said in the aftermath of October 7th. And, this is in part because of the very good article that you and Scott Horton wrote, detailing how this was a long-standing policy of Benjamin Netanyahu to support Hamas. And because that was his legacy is the ultimate failure, the largest attack, the largest group of death of civilians in the history of Israel was on his watch as a direct result of his policy. And so he has to rewrite that narrative. And I think how he's trying to rewrite it is to essentially say that, these people were martyrs, and that's the Islamic word for it, but they were essentially sacrifices to allow us to have this reaction to ultimately get what we wanted, which is to turn the Gaza Strip into a international host city or host area for luxury resorts in deals with Jared Kushner and others. All right, Connor, I'm going to hand it over to you. You've been doing some good writing for us at the Libertarian Institute. And so the first article you have up here is U.S. provides $2 billion in military aid package to Warsaw. So what's happening here, Connor?
Sure. So amidst all the other escalations being announced at the NATO summit in Washington right now, we've got the second $2 billion foreign military financing aid package being provided by the U.S. to Poland, who they are calling the tip of the spear in this, I guess, the campaign to strengthen NATO and in eyeing this war with Russia that they're preparing for, and getting all these, 35 to 50 additional brigades and hundreds of thousands of troops mobilized for this conflict. But so I wrote this one on July 8th. Washington is providing NATO ally Poland with a second $2 billion foreign military financing package in less than a year. And this came from Breaking Defense. In recent weeks, Warsaw has given Kiev a green light to use Polish-provided weapons to strike the Russian mainland, as well as signed a bilateral military pact with Ukraine, agreeing to shoot down some Russian missiles. And a State Department official had boasted to the outlet, unnamed, of course, of how the two FMF loans are benefiting the U.S. arms industry, as well as strengthening the Washington-led bloc embroiled in the Ukraine proxy war. He said, "It's impressive that it hasn't even been a year, and Poland they're moving out pretty quickly. We're happy with the process. We see it as a success. We're happy that they've been able to move out quickly. Not only does it help NATO, it helps the U.S. defense industry as well, the U.S. economy. So we're definitely happy with the process." Now, subsidizing European defense obviously doesn't help the American economy on its face. What we're doing is subsidizing both the European defense and then also the military-industrial complex here, which only further impoverishes the American people. Obviously, when you look at how much the American government spends on its military every year versus all the other NATO member states, it's completely dwarfed. And of course, we cover the vast majority of the NATO budget. And so obviously none of this helps the American people. It just helps the arms industry and I suppose some of the lower level workers in that industry, but primarily just the executives and people, frankly, like Lloyd Austin, who is now running the Pentagon and just stepped off of the Raytheon board of directors to take that job. So as with typical FMF loans, the funds furnished by the State Department to a foreign government, they have to be spent on American-made weaponry and equipment. But what makes this loan unique, as the official explains or the outlet explains, is that instead of a grant to purchase the arms, the loan includes interest, which Warsaw must repay. I'm not going to hold my breath for that, but the U.S. is putting up $60 million to guarantee the loan and cover initial fees. The official said details regarding how the funds will be spent on what kinds of weapons will not be shared during this week's NATO summit. Instead, he insists the Poles have a list of things they want to achieve and said to expect future announcements. The official noted the previous FMF loan issued last September had either been totally spent or is earmarked for purchases, including 4 aerostat-based early warning systems, which account for approximately half of the amount of the first loan. Now, the unusual loan-based structure, quote, allows the interagency to get FMF funding to foreign allies without needing to wait on the appropriations process, the outlet notes, adding Congress extended the authority to issue these loans through the end of the 2025 fiscal year. Now, asked if other countries will receive such loans, he answered, "We're looking at it, and there are other countries that remain competitive. The reason you're seeing Poland is, of course, the situation with the ongoing war in Ukraine. They're ready to move out." I'm not exactly sure what he means by that, but he keeps saying it. The official emphasized that talks with multiple countries are ongoing, while repeatedly praising Warsaw's high military spending and deeming Poland the tip of the spear for us right now. The State Department stated Poland is a leader in NATO, currently spending 4% of GDP on defense, the highest in the alliance. Just for perspective, the U.S. is spending about $1.7 trillion on our real military budget every year. It's about as big of a budget item as Medicaid. I think it's bigger than Medicare if you add in all the other expenses beyond the nominal Pentagon budget. So really, who cares what Poland's spending relative to its GDP? It's to say it's a drop in the bucket is an understatement. And obviously, we shouldn't even be doing any of this in the first place. But this is how they talk. So the U.S. has roughly. He talks about how they have they're the tip of the spear, and then the State Department put out a statement. I believe it was Matthew Miller actually, where they said Poland is a leader in NATO, currently spending 4% of GDP on defense, highest in the alliance. They host thousands of U.S. and allied forces, including the USV Corps headquarters forward in Poznan. The U.S. has roughly 10,000 troops stationed in Poland. Since Russian forces invaded Ukraine, Warsaw has announced plans to buy a myriad of American arms. And this is what Miller was celebrating in his statement on the State Department's site. Saying Abrams, they're talking about how they're buying Abrams tanks, Black Hawk and Apache helicopters, HIMARS rocket launchers, and seeking more Patriot air defense batteries as well. And the latest financial and military infusion comes after Ukraine and Poland signed their bilateral military pact this week, which includes a mechanism for Warsaw to shoot down Russian missiles and drones. And this provision entails the potential to provoke a direct NATO-Russia war, obviously, which could quickly turn nuclear. And this is something, not the nuclear aspect, but certainly the direct NATO involvement is something that Volodymyr Zelensky has long sought. During a joint presser with Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk on Monday, Zelensky declared, "We are especially grateful for the special arrangements, and this is reflected in the security agreement. It provides for the development of a mechanism to shoot down by Poland Russian missiles and drones fired in the airspace of Ukraine in the direction of Poland." In November 2022, after a Ukrainian air defense missile killed 2 people in Poland, Zelensky and his top advisors infamously said that it was a Russian missile strike and were, demanding that NATO take action. And, really what they were saying was they're hinting anyway that this is an opportunity to implement Article 5 of the Mutual Defense Pact in the NATO Charter, which would mean war with Russia, World War III. Zelensky said in his video address at the time, "Hitting NATO territory with missiles, this is a Russian missile attack on collective security. This is a really significant escalation. Action is needed." The assessment was completely at odds with those made by the U.S., Poland, and NATO, which determined quickly that the Polish casualties were not the results of a Russian missile strike, but rather an errant Ukrainian air defense missile. And at the time, a diplomat from a NATO member state had told Financial Times, quote, "The Ukrainians are destroying our confidence in them. Nobody is blaming Ukraine, and they are openly lying. This is more destructive than the missile." So, just providing a bit of additional background there. This deal that Poland is making is, just another in a long line of escalations that we're seeing where it seems like the proxy war in Ukraine, even compared to the way it's been going these last more than 2 years, it seems to be going off the rails with, providing the F-16s, which may or may not be flying out of NATO bases in neighboring countries. Preparing for attacks on Russian territory, which, of course, the outgoing Secretary General Stoltenberg said Moscow shouldn't view this as an escalation. It's self-defense, And, of course, this talk about sending troops, the French leading a coalition of NATO member states to send troops to go and train Ukrainian forces for war with Russia, which would obviously open up more opportunities for NATO troops to be targeted by Russian warplanes and other strikes in the war. And then you have this, all these, it's not just Poland, of course. We have a scores of NATO states who have authorized strikes into the Russian mainland, including the U.S. and London. And and this is, again, where the Russians have said, look, if you do that, then we will strike facilities in your military facilities, NATO military facilities in Ukraine and beyond. And they said that specifically after David Cameron said, as Foreign Secretary said, for the British said that they can go ahead and use our missiles to go and attack Russian territory. And so it's just continually to spiral out of control. But as the State Department said, it's very good for the defense industry. Okay, so this next story, this is about Netanyahu. who's actually apparently concerned that he's going to get arrested, given that the ICC, Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, is seeking arrest warrants to put him, as well as his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, on trial for war crimes committed in the besieged Gaza Strip. So I wrote this yesterday for the Institute. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu decided against stopping over in Europe prior to his coming address to the U.S. Congress over concerns regarding his arrest warrant application with the ICC, Israeli media reports. So the chief prosecutor, of course, is seeking warrants to put Netanyahu and Gallant on trial for war crimes committed in Gaza, as well as three of the leaders of Hamas. Now, on Wednesday, Israel's Reshet Bet radio station explained that the Israeli leader was considering a layover in a friendly European country, as there were discussions about the feasibility of his plane, the Wing of Zion, making the direct flight. Hungary and the Czech Republic were reportedly suggested as possible layover options en route to the U.S. However, Netanyahu is said to be against any pauses in the trip, fearing a potential arrest. So although the U.S. has railed against the war and applications and, of course, threatened retaliation, even staunch European supporters of Israel's war effort against the Palestinians living in the bombed-out coastal enclaves such as Germany have conceded that if the warrant is issued and the prime minister travels to Germany, they will arrest Netanyahu. Likewise, there is anticipation that London's new Labour government will drop its legal bid to prevent the court from issuing the arrest warrants. Therefore, the report says that the prime minister's plane will carry only about 60 people, with the remainder of his delegation taking separate flights. Now, as Middle East Eye elaborates, quote, Israel is not a member of the ICC. However, the state of Palestine was granted membership in 2015. The court can therefore investigate Israeli individuals for crimes committed in occupied Palestine, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. So although the U.S. is not a member of the court, the U.K., France, and several of Israel's Western allies are ICC members and thus are obligated under the Rome Statute to follow through with Netanyahu's arrest. So in addition to his congressional address, the Israeli leader is overseeing a war which the World Court in addition to his congressional address, the Israeli leader overseeing a war which the World Court has deemed a plausible genocide will meet with President Joe Biden in person for the first time since last October. Polls show that at least half of Americans who voted for Biden during the last election believe Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. The White House has already furnished Tel Aviv with over $6.5 billion in weapons for Netanyahu's war, transferred tens of thousands of bombs, including 14,000 one-ton bombs alone. From the early days of the war, these 2,000-pound munitions were routinely dropped in the areas falsely described by the Israeli apartheid army as safe zones. And we've seen more of that this week. It's gotten to the point now when they tell Palestinians to evacuate areas like Gaza City and to move south to Deir al-Balah and other areas in central Gaza. The Palestinians don't even bother being displaced for the umpteenth time at this point in this canned hunt of this civilian population because they know there is no place to go that's safe. So this week, a group of United Nations experts declared Israel's intentional and targeted starvation campaign against the Palestinian people as a form of genocidal violence and has resulted in famine across all of Gaza. And the Israeli onslaught has slaughtered nearly 40,000 Palestinians, including mostly women and children, and left approximately 10,000 more trapped under rubble or presumed dead, destroyed over half the buildings across the entire strip, decimated the health infrastructure, and laid waste to agricultural land and facilities amidst a strangulation blockade prohibiting the entry of food and other vital aid. The Lancet, a UK-based medical journal, published an article that estimates even if a permanent ceasefire, which Netanyahu is emphatically opposed to, was implemented immediately, more than 186,000 Palestinians in Gaza would still be killed due to his merciless campaign's direct violence and its indirect effects, which will carry on for years and years. Gallant and Netanyahu face war crimes and crimes against humanity charges, including the use of starvation of civilians in the Strip as a method of war. Of course, that's a violation of the Geneva Convention, collective punishment, willful killing, extermination, and as I said, collective punishment. The chief prosecutor is also seeking warrants for, as I mentioned earlier, the 3 Hamas officials. So, it's just unbelievable. The complicit. Every death in Gaza is on the hands of the American government. and everybody particularly on the Arab Street, but around the rest of the world, knows that. And so to have Netanyahu, somebody who is, at least according to the international community at this point, there's not that much dispute that a genocide is being committed. Certainly, you have the ICJ saying that it's plausible, and the fact that there have been, I mean, the fact that the longest serving Israeli prime minister is wanted for, or is going to be imminently wanted for a war crimes trial is just unbelievable when you consider, especially the way we grew up being just battered constantly with endless propaganda about how Israel is America's best friend and our greatest ally. Meanwhile, they kill Americans every year, and almost every year, and nobody says anything about it. Like when they blew Shireen Abu Akleh's face off, the longtime reporter for Al Jazeera shot her in the face outside the Jenin refugee camp, and they commit all kinds of war crimes on the American people's dime and effectively in our name too, which provoke horrible terrorist attacks on the United States. And as Kyle, you've been covering, we have State Department officials acknowledging now that the head of the State Department's intelligence department saying that our support and Israel's war in the Gaza Strip is provoking all kinds of it's going to provoke all kinds of terrorist blowback against the United States, and so this does nothing to improve our security. And the fact that Congress is so eager to prove their fealty to the Israeli prime minister, especially at a time like this, just demonstrates that we really are committed to this path of diplomatic isolation around the world. And to what benefit exactly? I mean, it doesn't help the American people at all. We've provided Israel more than $300 billion adjusted for inflation since 1948, the highest recipient in history of American foreign aid. And we get really nothing for it. I mean, they helped lobby us into the war in Iraq. We were attacked on 9/11 largely as a result of our unconditional support militarily, diplomatically, and economically for Israel. And now we're paying billions of dollars, almost $20 billion, well, roughly $20 billion this year alone to fund the Israeli final solution for the Palestinians, at least in Gaza. And as we're going to get to here in one of the next stories, there's also a massive powder keg ready to blow in the West Bank, and we could see a whole other Nakba take place because that's really, I mean, the goal of his right-wing coalition. And as you said earlier, I mean, I don't have any question either that Netanyahu, one of his goals personally, is to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. I think that's the only way he can really, rescue his legacy after, as you mentioned earlier, the security failures on October 7th and the decades-long policy of backing Hamas cynically to prevent any negotiations over a two-state solution. And again, this was all about just taking the Palestinians' land. It was all about politics, and they just used Hamas as an excuse to commit unspeakable war crimes and genocide and ethnic cleansing out in the open for everybody to see. And again, it's the worst kind of reflection on the American people and our government because they're ostensibly our representatives, and it's just reprehensible. So, okay, now just to some Israeli politics. This next story: top rabbi calls on ultra-Orthodox Israelis to dodge draft orders. Okay, I can get behind that. But this is very interesting because, the Israeli High Court ruled last month unanimously, all 9 justices, that the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox community, is no longer exempt from the mass enlistment policy, the mass mandatory enlistment policy. And, for the longest time, the ultra-Orthodox student community has been subsidized by the rest of the citizenry who, at the same time that, Israel's economy has taken a massive hit. They've spent something like $60 billion on this war already. You've got at least 600 Israeli soldiers that have been killed and thousands more wounded. And they're eyeing a much larger war now with Lebanon, Hezbollah, and, but really against the state of Lebanon. And if that does happen, we're going to see a drastic expansion of the war, especially from the rest of the axis of resistance and the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. And so, of course, they're looking for ways to increase the ranks of their military. They can't just totally rely on U.S. troops to do their fighting for them, primarily against Iran, of course, but they're going to have to fight Hezbollah mostly themselves. at least the way things look right now. But so we have one of the top rabbis in Israel, head of Israeli yeshiva, one of the religious schools east of Tel Aviv, strongly criticizing the high court's decision. And listen, I mean, government lawyers, when they were talking to the court at the time before this ruling, said that this decision will tear the Israeli society apart. And the Shah's party and the United Torah Judaism party, which are part of Netanyahu's coalition, these are ultra-Orthodox parties, have been furious over this ruling and have vowed to oppose it. Likud is working hard to get some sort of a bill into the Knesset to try and reverse this order, but I don't think they're going to have enough time to pull that off. And again, this is the kind of thing that can very much threaten Netanyahu's fragile ruling coalition, just at the same time that he's accusing, at least his family is accusing the IDF of fomenting a coup against him. And it's not exactly clear that he has a great relationship with Itamar Ben-Gvir. Likud and Jewish Power have been trading a lot of blows recently. They've accused Itamar Ben-Gvir of leaking state secrets and so forth. But anyway, so, and this is a big deal. We've seen a lot of protests carried out in Jerusalem. And people blocking roads, and there's talk of as this draft resistance. And so Rabbi Dov Lando, the head of this Israeli yeshiva school east of Tel Aviv, has strongly criticized the high court's decision to order the enlistment to the ultra-Orthodox into the army, calling on Haredi Jews not to show up to recruitment offices. So he wrote in an article published in the ultra-Orthodox Yated Netiyem newspaper on July 11, during the years of government here in Israel, there was an understanding with military authorities that yeshiva members would not be drafted. Now the situation is that the courts have declared war against the world of Torah, and they are the ones who opened a front and came to change the arrangement that existed all these years and ordered the army to begin the actual recruitment process of yeshivas. The order for yeshiva members is do not show up at recruitment offices at all and do not respond to any summons. Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant said earlier this week that the Israeli army will begin drafting Haredi Jews into the military next month. After the ruling, a lot of opposition parties were telling, the defense minister, telling Gallant, go draft them now, because there's so much resentment for this community. Really living off the dole and not having to fight in the war. Which I understand. I also very much support the resistance to the draft here. It's, of course, conscription is an absolute crime against humanity, especially when you're talking about, drafting people to go and fight a genocide and ethnically cleanse one of the poorest, most defenseless, long since militarily conquered populations in the world, like the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So yeah, there's been a huge fight over this. The movement for quality government were the ones that were calling for the Haredis to be drafted immediately, the Haredim. Gallant approved the IDF recommendation to issue draft orders to the Haredim in accordance with the IDF's absorption and screening capabilities, and after a significant process of refining then existing data regarding potential recruits is carried out, his office said in a statement. The Israeli High Court ruled on June 25th that male Haredim who are eligible for service must be drafted into the military, a decision that threatens the already fragile unity in Netanyahu's coalition. Ultra-Orthodox Israeli Jews of military age have been able to avoid compulsory enlistment into the army for decades by enrolling in yeshivas and obtaining repeated one-year service deferrals until they reach the age of military exemption. So the issue has, of course, been of great tension in Israel lately, particularly following the start of the war, as many in the government believe that the burden of service falls on all Israelis. Others, namely leaders of the far-right religious parties on which the coalition relies, have been pushing for continued exemptions of the Haredim. The draft orders come as the Israeli army is facing a serious enlistment crisis. The army has been plagued by shortages of soldiers due to heavy losses being taken during battles with the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, and due to a very high volume of deaths and injuries as a result of the war, the IDF still needs a significant amount of manpower, says a draft bill from mid-June supported by the Israeli government and aimed at extending the retirement age of reservists. The Army has been working to establish a new division to help deal with the enlistment crisis. Recent reports also show exhaustion from the war has contributed to an alarming unwillingness of soldiers to continue serving. And if I didn't mention earlier, this is, as you can see on the screen, but if you're just listening, this is from The Cradle. And so is this next story from their news desk. Israel shells Syrian army sites in the occupied Golan Heights. So the Israeli army shelled several sites belonging to the Syrian Arab Army in the occupied Golan Heights on July 10th. According to Tel Aviv, the sites in question were established in violation of the 1974 disengagement agreement, the deal signed indirectly between Damascus and Tel Aviv that officially ended the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. An Israeli army spokesman said in a statement that earlier today, the IDF attacked with tanks and artillery military infrastructure of the Syrian army, which exceeded the separation of forces agreement between Israel and Syria in the buffer zone. The IDF considers the Syrian army responsible for everything that happens in its territory and will not allow attempts to violate the separation agreement. Now, the part on their side of the line, the Israeli side of the Golan Heights that's illegally occupied, of course, they're not supposed to be there. I need to see more details. I've read a few different stories on these latest bombings in Syria, and it's not exactly clear to me what the Syrian Arab Army was actually doing that would justify or even have a pretense to justify an illegal strike and from this illegally occupied territory. Such as this. It sounds like more of this was in response to some recent tit for tat strikes between Hezbollah and the Israelis, especially after another high-profile assassination of a former bodyguard for Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, that Israel carried out on the Syrian side of the Syria-Lebanon border. So the attacks come a day after 2 Israeli settlers were killed by a Hezbollah operation in the occupied Golan Heights. The operation was a response to Israel's assassination of Hezbollah fighter Yasser Nemer Karnabash, a former bodyguard to Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah, on July 9th. Israel struck the vehicle that he was in on the Syrian side of the Lebanese border. So Hezbollah said in a statement on Tuesday, in response to the attack and assassination carried out by the Israeli enemy in Al Sabora on the Damascus-Beirut road, the Mujahideen of the Islamic Resistance bombed on Tuesday, 7/9/24, in several barrages the headquarters of the 210 Golan Division at Nafa base with dozens of Katyusha rockets. The Lebanese resistance group has launched several drone and rocket attacks on the Golan Heights since the start of the war in October, but has recently increased operations against the occupied territory in response to a series of Israeli assassinations this month, as well as continued attacks on civilians in Lebanon. Earlier on Tuesday, Hezbollah released a new 9-minute video showing drone footage of sensitive Israeli army sites that it is capable of striking in the Syrian Golan Heights, among other locations. So, of course, we're just looking at further escalations here. I think when war really does break out between Israel and Hezbollah, which it seems like it's going to be here sooner rather than later, you're going to see a lot more strikes into Syria. And of course, the Shiite militias there, who have been calmed down at the insistence of Iran for many months now, are going to likely resume their strikes. We have 900 American troops and probably just as many, if not more, contractors illegally occupying about a third of Syrian territory, and they're under crippling sanctions. You have 90% of the population living below the poverty line as a result of Washington's economic war, which is really just aimed at succeeding in what their dirty war against Damascus, where they took Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's side, actually, that didn't achieve. So Assad was never overthrown. 500,000 people were killed in that war. Of course, Israel was backing the Al-Qaeda forces and ISIS forces at the time as well, along with NATO ally Turkey, who also occupies some territory in the north there, although there does appear to be some rapprochement beginning between the Turks and the Syrians now, so there could be some negotiations about resolving that. But nevertheless, you're going to probably see more Israeli strikes in Syria. They did step up their airstrikes quite a bit after a bit of a lull after Iran retaliated for its bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which is akin to bombing Iranian soil. And they killed several very prominent military figures, and along with several civilians. And but since then, Israel did step up its strikes in Syria, and we're seeing more just like this. But it's a very risky situation, and it's been an absolute travesty that we haven't gotten the American troops out of Syria after all this time. So now this next story is about the West Bank. This is from Mondo Weiss by Qassam Muadi. And this was written on the 10th, and it's about the coming economic collapse in the West Bank, which I mean, especially when you consider the fact that there's been, according to the UN, now well over 1,000 different settler attacks, which have included, just tons of property destruction and killings. We've seen more than 550 Palestinians murdered in the West Bank already since October 7th. Last year, according to UNICEF, was the deadliest year on record for children. And, we're also seeing the largest settlement expansion in more than 30 years, currently being undertaken by the previously mentioned finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who is effectively the occupation governor as well of the West Bank. Because of this special position he was given to hold in the defense ministry in a deal that was brokered, I believe, in December of 2022. But he and his allies, his ideological allies like Hillel Roth, have really been working overtime to expand the settlements, and all these different things, the constant attacks on the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing that's taking place, the settler attacks where they're just absolutely running wild immediately after the war began. It's been open season on the Palestinians, but we've also seen the sanctions and economic war launched against the PA and the Palestinians in the West Bank more broadly. Really seems to be coming for a breaking point, and this is a great report. So, Kassam writes here, last week, Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Mustafa announced that the Israeli Finance Ministry had released a part of the customs money that it had withheld from Palestinians for months under the order of hardline Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. The amount transferred was reported to amount to $260 million, equivalent to the Palestinian customs money Israel collected on the PA's behalf for the months of April, May, and June. But even that amount included an important deduction: the share of the Gaza Strip and the customs revenue, the social welfare reserved for the families of martyrs and political prisoners, and the PA's debts to Israel. Meanwhile, the World Bank decided to dramatically increase its annual aid to the PA from $70 million to $300 million, according to an announcement by Prime Minister Mustafa last week. The reason for this sudden influx of money and the reversal of the Israeli Finance Ministry's punitive measures against the PA is clear to most observers. The Palestinian Authority is on the edge of an economic meltdown. If it happens, this will also likely trigger the collapse of the PA as a governing authority. Expectations of such a scenario have been increasingly voiced in recent months, including by the World Bank, as the ongoing economic crisis in the West Bank has been accentuated by Israel's economic sanctions. 7th. Smotrich, pro-settlement hawk, sees the PA as an impediment to the ultimate Israeli goal of settlement expansion in the entire West Bank, despite the PA's security coordination with Israel. But the right-wing finance minister still agreed to ease some of the sanctions. The reason he did this was, according to an unnamed Western diplomatic source quoted by Al-Arabi al-Jadid, is that the transfer was part of an agreement between the U.S. and Israel. Israel would release the withheld customs money, and in exchange, the U.S. would allow Israel to legalize 4 Israeli settlement outposts in the northern West Bank. Notably, Israel has already started the legalization process, or already did a year ago under Netanyahu's right-wing government. Moreover, just last week, Israel announced the single largest Palestinian land grab in over 30 years, seizing 1,269 hectares of land in the Jordan Valley region. Yet even the partial loosening of restrictions on withheld customs money to the PA doesn't come close to solving the PA's economic crisis. Israel's economic sanctions have forced hundreds of thousands of Palestinian public sector employees to survive on little to no salaries for months on end, while Israel still maintains its revocation of work permits for some 100,000 Palestinian laborers who used to work in Israel and Israeli settlements before October 7th. The measures have crippled the flow of money in the West Bank, leading to an inflation of prices and pushing hundreds of thousands of families into poverty. The economic crisis is also compounded by the deep political instability brought about by the PA's inability to shield Palestinians from violent Israeli raids. The UN reported last week, the count was, I believe, 28 airstrikes in the West Bank since October 7th, which is just really unbelievable. They began to carry out some airstrikes in the West Bank, I believe, during a raid on the Jenin refugee camp back in July of last year. But that was unheard of. It was the first time we'd seen anything like that in 15 years. So, it's just unbelievable. And daily arrest campaigns, assassination missions in the Palestinian population centers. Many observers are seeing the writing on the wall, concluding that an economic meltdown or a political explosion are likely to shake the West Bank. So Zain Abu Daqqa, a Palestinian economist, activist, and entrepreneur, told Mondo Wise, Palestinians in the West Bank have been expecting the bare minimum from the PA. just to be able to provide regular salaries and some law and order. But the fact that the PA relies so much on an income that can be withheld by Israel makes it unable to do the minimum expected from it. And the increases in social pressure, this increases social pressure in the streets. In the long run, the situation will get out of control. But I don't believe either Israel or the U.S. will let the PA fall. The PA is an important part of the economic system, enabling businesses in the West Bank and maintaining security control. And even Smotrich, who withholds the customs money, knows this. Smotrich is not the minister of finance. Is not only the minister of finance, he also holds ruling powers over Palestinians through his control of the civil administration, the Israeli governing body ruling over most of the West Bank. His intention is to see the downfall of the PA and to bring the entire West Bank under Israeli rule. In April, Smotrich called for the overthrow of the PA, calling it a direct danger to the state of Israel. Since then, a leaked plan tied to the minister reveals that he intends to annex over 60% of the West Bank, the lands known under the Oslo Accords as Area C, to Israel proper. But Abduka believes that the much of Smotrich's rhetoric is bluster. Smotrich can make big statements about bringing down the PA, but eventually when he releases some of the PA's money and gets U.S. approval to legalize 4 or 5 outposts in the West Bank in exchange, that shows it is exactly what he was looking for from the beginning, Abu Dhaka tells Mondo Weiss. At the same time, 20% of Palestinians who were working in Israel before the war said that they continued to work in their previous workplaces because Israel needs the Palestinian workforce to keep the Israeli economy going. At the same time, Abu Dhaka believes that the economic strangulation of the West Bank creates social and political pressure on the PA. Such a situation can push the PA over the edge. Yet the crisis on the ground continues to grow. According to a poll conducted in April and May by an independent Palestinian think tank, 47% of Palestinians in the West Bank said that their families have been significantly affected by the economic situation. And 65% said that they felt the impact in the rise of food prices. According to the Eid Abu Munshar, the coordinator of Shabib al-Kahir, a volunteer-based initiative that distributes food parcels and hot meals to families in need in Hebron, the number of families in need in the city has increased from 120 before the war to over 500 in July. So during the Eid al-Adha feast in mid-June, we weren't able to cover all the requests for food. For help with food packages, Abu Manshar told Mondo Weiss. We were able to distribute less than 100 food packages out of more than 500 we had planned due to a severe drop in donations. We rely entirely on local donations from the community, he clarified, and many of our donors have themselves turned into needy families who require assistance, especially government employees and workers. This has all led to a dramatic drop in spending in the West Bank, which in turn has led businesses to suffer. Abu Munshar confirms that the local merchants in Hebron have been struggling to keep their business running. One of the cases is a family with 7 children, where the father was an experienced worker in Israel who earned enough to donate to our initiative. He hasn't worked a single day in Israel since the beginning of the war, and the family revenues dropped so severely that they struggle to even secure food and pay for basic life expenses. Another case is a family whose breadwinner is a government employee. He hadn't been regularly paid for months, and now he can't even look for odd jobs because he was arrested by the occupation forces, leaving his family without an income. Even employees in the PA security force have not been spared the economic crisis. Mondo Weiss spoke to an employee in the security forces in Ramallah who asked not to be named. He said, I've been relying on side jobs for months now, and we rely more on my wife's income now as she is an employee in the private sector. The only time in the past year and a half that I've received a full salary was March of 2023, and for the rest of the months, I received a 50 or 60% payment, sometimes an 80% payment, he continues. There's always a sentence on my salary slip that says that the government owes me the rest of the money to be paid when funds are available. The only thing keeping employees quiet is this sentence on our salary slips. According to Abu Dhaka, PA salaries account for around 30% of the West Bank's total salaries, while workers in Israel generate about 40% of the West Bank's total salaries, making these two sectors the backbone of the West Bank economy. This makes any crisis in their income into a general crisis in the rest of the economy, he explains. The reason for this is the attack. And it's a one-way relationship where the West Bank is a free market for Israeli production, and the development of Palestinian productive sector is very restricted by the economic accords the PA signed with Israel in the 1990s, mainly the Paris Economic Protocol. The PA itself relies on between 50 and 60% of its budget on the taxing of consumption through a 16% value-added tax rather than taxing income. And Abu Dhaka says that this is a product of the nature of the political system. To tax income and create some kind of equity would need a political situation where there is effective oversight and accountability, which in itself needs some level of civilian participation. And that needs a functioning parliament and elections. Abu Dhaka believes that even with the restrictive parameters of the Paris protocols, the PA could have invested in more productive sectors. But, quote, they took the easy path and went along with the political status quo, which is to rely on on a consumption economy, he states. The solution to this economic and social problem is not an economic one, but a political one, ending the occupation. By opening the space for citizen participation in economic decisions, or maybe holding elections, some of the social pressure might be diffused. But Abu Dhaka believes that the time has passed for any systemic structural change to the PA. Structural changes should have been done in times of stability, he explains. But now the only thing that can be done is to strengthen the system to survive a possible social upheaval. The Israeli genocide in Gaza continues unabated with no vision for how the war would wind down, generating a political crisis in Israel that provides Smotrich with the cover he needs to eat up the rest of the West Bank. The U.S. gives Smotrich what he wants in exchange for a fleeting restoration of the economic status quo ante, and the World Bank can rush in to further bolster the financial sector in the West Bank. But all this amounts to little more than a morphine shot, allowing the PA a temporary respite before a potential collapse. And, really, the violence has been surging, and the ethnic cleansing and displacement and the home demolitions in East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank, carried out by the Israeli state itself, have just been going through the roof. And, it's barbaric. I mean, some of these in these situations when they demolish somebody's homes, they'll make the Palestinians pay tens of thousands of dollars to finance the demolition of their own home because they're not Jewish, and then also pay the salaries of the security forces who are brought there to carry it, who are brought there to to carry out the eviction. So it's just unbelievable, and the number of Israeli raids has been going up substantially. We've been covering a lot of it at the Institute and antiwar.com, and it's just there's no real end in sight for this. As long as the war in Gaza continues, and of course Netanyahu is trying to drag it out for as long as possible. I mean, you even had Ehud Olmert writing that article where he was saying Netanyahu is an existential threat to the state of Israel. He should be put on trial. And one of the things he was talking about in there is how his war and his government has emboldened what is essentially settler terrorism in the West Bank with Itamar Ben-Gvir handing out 10,000 assault rifles to the settlers. And they've just been running wild ever since, killing Palestinians from the very first week of the war. The story that I always recount and remember is, just a couple days. I believe it might have been on the 9th of October, the same day that Yoav Gallant announced the complete siege on Gaza, saying we're going to be cutting the food, the water, the fuel, the electricity, and the medicine because the Palestinians are human animals and we will treat them accordingly. I mean, I believe on that same day was the murder at the funeral procession for some Palestinian olive farmers who were murdered the day before by settlers. So then settlers showed up and murdered a father and a son at the funeral procession for these slain Palestinian olive farmers. And it's been just off to the races ever since. We've seen a lot of ethnic cleansing carried out in areas, rural areas outside of Hebron. And that's one of the things that Smotrich talks about. It's not just the violence and intimidation and the burning of homes and crops and stealing livestock and this kind of thing. What they're also doing is taking up farmland and then expanding it further and further. And they use this as an instrument of ethnic cleansing and taking control over more and more territory in the West Bank. One of the big notable aspects of this latest settlement expansion that's being implemented is that it's in the Jordan Valley, and it runs along a very crucial sort of corridor there that's runs along the border with Jordan. So the idea is to cut off these Palestinian communities, and so that you can basically choke them off and put them into increasingly smaller and smaller sort of islands surrounded by Israeli territory, because they're declaring these illegal settlements as state lands, legalizing these previously illegal outposts, and just making sure that there's absolutely never going to be a two-state solution. And of course, the way Israeli politics are now, and particularly in the aftermath of the war on Gaza, there's really, I mean, we can hope that there can be a solution one day for one state with equal rights for all citizens. But that's the last thing that the Israelis want, particularly these hardline elements and the supporters of Netanyahu. We do have 80% of the Israeli population that either believes that the war is, they support the war as it's being carried out currently against the Palestinians, or they think it should be escalated further, which is hard to fathom sitting here in the United States and watching the constant live stream of all these massacred men, women, and children since October 7th, and just seeing the absolute carnage every single day. I mean, they just have a different interpretation. They don't see it that way as a tragedy. They see this as revenge and necessary for the security of their state. And they are absolutely. I mean, you hear it from the IDF soldiers when they spray graffiti in the West Bank, like no victory without settlement. And they're carrying out a very similar policy in the West Bank. So as they crush the economy there, it's going to provoke potentially another intifada, or you could see if a war with Lebanon breaks out, some of the Shiite militias or different groups. For the Houthis threatened to do this before, if they can, to try and make their way to Palestine and fight on behalf of the occupied population there, the Muslims and the Christians. It's an absolute massive powder keg. And really, it's very important that everybody keep an eye on what's going on in the West Bank. Because obviously everybody is paying attention to the genocide itself, but my fear is that that's going to carry over now into the rest of the occupied territories not too far from now.
All right, Connor, thank you for the update. And everybody, thank you for tuning into the show this week. Reminder, if you can, please head on over to the Libertarian Institute and contribute to our fundraiser. And Connor, again, thank you for doing the show.
Thank you.